There, this is Lindsay from Big Sandy Skills U, and today I want to talk to you about women's suffrage. So I have a PowerPoint for us, and we're also going to watch a couple of videos. So, women's suffrage. There's a couple of definitions we need to go over because these are going to be words you're going to see a lot, and I want to make sure that you know what they mean. So suffrage just means the right to vote in political elections. Sometimes it's used maybe interchangeably with enfranchisement or enfranchise, which means to give the right to vote, and then disenfranchise means the state of being deprived of the right to vote. So for a long time, women were disenfranchised. We did not have the right to vote, just the way freed slaves didn't have the right to vote, or sometimes, especially in the 1880s and 90s, there were a lot of laws prohibiting African Americans from voting. So they were disenfranchised. And then the word ratify or ratification, which is the act of signing or giving full consent to a certain law and treaty made by the government. So I usually say when something's ratified, it was like put into effect. It was fully born. It was fully in action. So let's talk about one of the first things that happened that really sparked the women's suffrage movement. Started in 1854, I think. And that was the Seneca Falls Convention. There it is, Seneca Falls Convention. And this group of women in Seneca Falls got together and they started to talk about their status in society. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is this lady here, she was the ringleader of this. And she said she wanted to get together to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. She wrote like a pamphlet or a paper called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, and in it she said it is the duty to women in this country to secure themselves the sacred right to franchise, which would be the right to vote. This lady was actually going to be pivotal in the women's suffrage movement. She was very active in a lot of the early formation of like ladies groups. Here's another quote that she had: because man and woman are the complement of one another, we need woman's thoughts in national affairs to make a safe and stable government. She had a lot of quotes. When I looked up quotes by her with pictures attached to them, there were a lot. So she was very prolific for the age. She was very well known. She would have been like the figurehead. Her and Susan B. Anthony, who we're going to talk to in a little while. So in the midst of all this happening, there's a lot of other social changes going on, because if that happened in 1854, then there was the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, there were all these amendments to give freed slaves the same rights as white America. So the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment reversed the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision was if a slave from a slave state was taken to a non-slave state, then he was then free. That's what Dred Scott wanted to happen, but the Supreme Court ruled that a slave who was owned by someone from a slave state was a slave no matter their location. So the 14th Amendment took that away and said a free person is a free person. And then a 15th Amendment said that states couldn't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So these amendments really took care of the newly freed population of the African Americans, particularly in the South. So another lady who was pivotal in the women's suffrage movement was Susan B. Anthony. She was constantly lobbying for women's rights. She was constantly being a part of all of these different activism groups and being a speaker, being a writer. She was part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So there were these groups that would lobby for women's rights, that would petition, that would protest, that would just work for creating awareness for the problem that is women's lack of the right to vote. So surprisingly, Women in the West were given the right to vote way before women in women in the East. So by 1910, the western states of Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and Washington had granted enfranchisement to women. So they had the right to vote. Now, this is my personal opinion. I added this in here. So what was the reason? Why was it in the West? I think it's because the West didn't get stuck up in the Civil War, number one, where people wanted to make distinctions between those who were worthy and those who were not. I think in the West, especially in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there were a lot of homesteading going on. There was a lot of moving west, where the East was more culturalized. It had been settled, by the 1890s, it had been settled for 300 years. And a lot of these people, it had a clear class system. So there were the haves and the have-nots. But in the West, it was like everybody had to earn their bread. There could have been rich people. Yes, I'm sure there were rich people, especially because like the gold rush in 49 and then what was happening in Alaska and all that. But I just feel like people in the West, especially those people who were homesteading, especially those people who were seeking to strike out on their own, left behind the class system, left behind, segregation, and needed to survive. And so if you were a member of this, if you were a part of this, if you did your work the same as a man, then you should have the same voice as a man. So that's my own personal opinion. I tried to look up a really nice little quick answer for it, and I didn't get one. So I don't know why the technical reason is why the West was so forward-thinking when it came to women's suffrage, but the East wasn't. So there's that. Now, in this era from the 1890s to about 1920, this is known as the Progressive Era. So there were a lot of reforms going on. There were a lot of problems that had happened because of the rapid industrialization of America, the immigration that happened in America. I think in 1820, America's population doubled because over 1 million people came in the span of a decade and immigrated to America. And so there's all kinds of problems that are happening because of this. We don't have the infrastructure in place because of this. We don't have laws protecting people from being abused or being mistreated or taken advantage of. So children as young as 3 were working. Children as young as 3 were working 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day. Women would have been working in sweatshops. Men would have been working 16 hours a day, making barely enough money to support their families. And there were just a lot of desperation. There was no help coming from no one. There was no welfare system. There was no government that cared about you. So during the Progressive Era, a lot of people, especially who were considered middle class and had the opportunity to sit and think about the suffering of other people because they didn't have to work, they started to realize that you need to take care of people. There were child labor laws passed. There was equality for African Americans. African Americans were given the right to vote. And working conditions were improved. You get the 8-hour workday from this time span. You get living conditions. Think about Upton Sinclair writing the book The Jungle, which was actually about meatpacking plants in Chicago and how disgusting they were, and they would grind up mice and stuff. And so you get the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, who's taking care and making sure everybody's facilities are clean. All of these things that are now standard regulation and standard mode of operation in the 1800s didn't exist. So during this era from 1890 to about 1912 is the Progressive Era. Women had a huge part in this. Women really started a lot of the movements that ended up going into the social work field, taking care of children, taking care of mothers who were pregnant out of wedlock, taking care of widows. And they started to have a voice in social reform. They, when 10,000 people come together, you can't ignore their voice. And so they started lobbying, petitioning, marching, protesting about the treatment of children, about the treatment of women, about the treatment of this and that. And so what that did was that created an awareness of a woman's voice on the stage that is American life. They were being reported on in the newspapers. People were just becoming more aware of it. We do the same thing today, like when we try to market and get well known in the community. That's what they were doing. They were trying to get their message out there. They were trying to, whatever. So it highlighted their presence, and they wanted a voice to participate in the legislation that dictated their lives. So leading up to this, the progressive era, in England, the suffragettes, who are the women who are fighting for the right to vote, had been slowly picking up steam for about 50 years leading up to about 1910. And I believe they got the right to vote in England before we did in America by a bit. But I wanted to show a video that shows some of the things that these women who were fighting for the right to vote were suffering through. So they were being arrested. This woman over here is being arrested. Once they were in prison, sometimes they would go on hunger strikes to say, you're not in control of me, I'm in control of me. And because of those hunger strikes, they were often force-fed and really mistreated in prison. They were often abused in prison. They would often come out with black eyes and busted lips, and it was a really hard time. Slick scenes, because they needed that attention. They needed to show that they were not going to be stopped. So, in the 1900s, people in the women's suffrage movement really started to become quite a loud presence in the American culture. So this lady is Alice Paul, and she became like the new spokesperson. She became the new figurehead. She went so far as to chain herself and her fellow suffragettes to the White House gate and the White House fence for the statement of, we're here, we're present. So lots of that stuff was happening. And then finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, which says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So there you have it. We finally gained the right to vote and a voice in government. So for an overall theme, just know that the women's right to vote was a very slow-going process. It happened over the course of 60, 70 years of active participation by numerous women and advocates. It did not happen overnight. It did cost many people their livelihoods. It cost a lot of lives. But in today's society, we women reap the benefits of their efforts. So this was just a video to give you a little more background on women's suffrage. If you want to research this further, of course, I would suggest that you go to YouTube. But check out that movie, Suffragette, because it really does a wonderful job of humanizing the struggle. If you have any questions, reach out to your instructor.